Alright, so I'm back for the second plateau of Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateaus. This is titled 1914, One or Many Wolves. Now, in order to gain some background, I think it's useful to understand what the Wolfman is. The Wolfman was one of Freud's patients, and he talks about the Wolfman in this case analysis where there's this man who goes to be called the Wolfman, and he has this dream that he's in his bed and his window is across the foot of his bed. And he's staring at the window and he awakes suddenly, just kind of out of impulse, and he opens and the window springs open on its own accord, and outside there's a tree with 6 or 7 white wolves on it, and their tails have been changed out for like a sheep's tail or some other tail, and they're just staring at him very intently, but they're not moving. There's no movement in the dream whatsoever. Now, Freud, through a bunch of gymnastics, basically is trying to figure out, okay, what does this dream mean? And for Freud, dreams are telling us something about our desires. And for Freud, our desires are defined by the Oedipus complex and the castration complex, which is going to mean that inevitably desire returns to the parents, and the most traumatic forms of neuroses, these sicknesses that are purely mental, that aren't physical, but they don't necessarily, this is like depression and anxiety and stuff like this. These anxieties, which come out through dreams, for Freud is always going to return back to the parents. So Freud's job is basically to read the mother and father into everything. And Freud does all this gymnastics to connect this to the story of this girl and 7 wolves or something, or an old man and 7 wolves or something. I just read The Wolfman yesterday, so I should remember. But Freud basically says what this dream means, and this is the key part, is Freud is the one that creates the latent content of the dream, because you've got the apparent content of the dream that shows up as the dream content, but you've got the latent content behind that, which is what the dream is supposed to represent. And the important part there is that a dream is never what it is. This is kind of like Freud and Lacan both are like, there are no coincidences. Everything is significatory or semiotic in some way, and hierarchical and structurally related to the phallus, Oedipus, castration, neuroses, whatever it may be, the desire for the father. And Freud, in his dream analyses, creates the latent content. The whole point of Freud's dream analyses is that the stuff that he brings out is the stuff the patient would not have been able to do on his own. And it precisely interprets the dream to make it what it is through the lens of Oedipus and the castration complex. And he does all this workaround to basically say, okay, what this dream is representing is when you were young, it was a summer day and you were asleep and you awoke suddenly to find your parents having sex. And all this stuff that's in the dream can be reduced to that moment, which Freud has created and said is representative of the dream. Now, this sounds even more absurd if you haven't read Freud's texts. I think that's why it is nice to read Freud, just to see how his method works, because this is the thing, is it's not a rigorous method. It is strictly unfalsifiable. This is why Deleuze and Guattari will say in this plateau that an essential part of Freud's work is that you don't really have to do anything, and you just ignore the patient and you write in Oedipus here, castration here, neuroses here, the father with a capital F here. So in this plateau, Deleuze and Guattari are going to lay out really their model for analysis, which is going to include looking at assemblages and intensities and multiplicities, and they're also going to provide their critiques of Freud's methodology and try to come to a non-hierarchical form of psychoanalysis, which they call schizoanalysis. Now, Deleuze and Guattari recognize rather quickly that a big problem with Freud's analyses is that the actual content of the dreams, the wolves, the tree, the whiteness of the wolves, the stillness of everything, the sense of anxiety, all of this is reduced to Oedipus, to the father, whatever kind of structural law you want to think of. And they think that this is one of the biggest missteps of Freud, is assuming that we can reduce one experience to what it represents. They want to avoid representation entirely. They think if we always want to look at something as what it represents, we will always be looking past that thing to try to find that latent content which it really is. This kind of really is can only be achieved by presupposing that what we're looking at is not what really is, but we must go beyond. And that beyond is going to be structured by some sort of unity. They say for Freud, when the thing splinters and loses its identity, the word is still there to restore that identity or invent a new one. Freud counted on the word to reestablish a unity no longer found in things. Are we not witnessing the first stirrings of subsequent adventure, that of the signifier, the devious despotic agency that substitutes itself for asignifying proper names and replaces multiplicities with the dismal unity of an object declared lost? And this is the important thing, is that we see this a lot more in Lacan, is that there is an object which is lost, which desire is aimed at retrieving to make the subject what it is. And this distance between the subject and the object is the subject's nothingness himself. The subject is always the nothingness represented by the lack, which is that object which is outside of himself. And when we do this, we presuppose and restore an identity to what the subject is, namely lacking and desiring the father. And this is all done by supplanting reality in favor of a presupposed unity. And they show that Freud doesn't really want to talk about the actual dream content. They say, who is ignorant of the fact that wolves travel in packs? Only Freud. Every child knows it, not Freud. With false scruples, he asks, how are we to explain the fact that there are 5, 6, or 7 wolves in this dream? The result is the same, since it is always a question of bringing back the unity or identity of the person or allegedly lost object. The wolves will have to be purged of their multiplicity. Freud assumes, and his whole project is legitimized by the fact that the subject is presumed ahead of time to be lacking, to be essentially Oedipal. And by doing this, the real content of the dream is necessarily, if it doesn't show itself as being Oedipal, if mommy and daddy aren't immediately there in the dream, that's the sign that they're behind the dream. And in this sense, Freud and Lacan too create a problematic of something that doesn't need to be a problematic. Instead of saying, okay, well, why are these wolves, why are they white? Why this particular number? Instead of asking these questions, Freud really says this number must be reducible to 1. It must be reducible to the one father. And by doing this, the multiplicity, which is really representative of the varying content in the mysterious content of the dream gets reduced to a significatory unity. They explain in kind of funny terms how Freud, throughout his analyses, kind of reduces the 7 or 6 wolves to 5, to 4, to 3, to 2, and they say 1 wolf. The wolf is the father, as we all knew from the start. 0 wolves, he lost his tail. He is not just a castrator, but also castrated. Who is Freud trying to fool? The wolves never had a chance to get away and save their pack. It was already decided from the very beginning that animals could serve only to represent coitus between parents, or conversely be represented by coitus between the parents. Which is to say, when we presuppose the Oedipal identity or the Oedipal structuration of the dream, the content either is an homage to the parents or is reduced to the parents themselves. It's always either indicative of the parents and thus a signifier, which shows that the parents are ultimately what is being referred to, or they are reduced to the parents themselves. The formations they make, like a V, are the spread legs of the mother getting fucked or whatever. And this connects back to a quote that I used in the last lecture on the introduction, where they say, with regards to psychoanalysis, it bases its own dictatorial power upon a dictatorial conception of the unconscious. And Deleuze and Guattari later are going to get into exactly how psychoanalysis presupposes the subject as a unitary, isolated phenomenon. But in general, it should be fairly obvious that the supposed representation of the dream, of the actual content of the dream, can only be a representation if it's assumed what it is they are representing ahead of time. In contrast to this, Deleuze and Guattari want to talk about becoming wolf, becoming animal. Becoming is perhaps one of their most important emphases, and it stands in stark contrast to static ontologies, where objects are static and isolated and are in themselves. Instead, Deleuze and Guattari want to focus on ontology as a social process that crosses filiative boundaries and establishes connections. And if we want to understand what desire is, we have to broaden to this idea of becoming. Just like for Heraclitus, who talks about you can't step into the same river twice and focuses on becoming as a central part of ontology. The same goes for Deleuze and Guattari. And in this sense, they're trying to access ontology as multiplicity, not as oneness like Hegel was trying to do, where he says, oh, the river is insofar as it is its notness, that the river is always its changingness. They want to say, Deleuze and Guattari, that no, there is no river with a capital R. There is simply this multiplicitous, rhizomatic structuring process. They say, in becoming wolf, the important thing is the position of the mass, and above all, the position of the subject itself in relation to the pack or wolf multiplicity. How the subject joins or does not join the pack, how far away it stays, how it does or does not hold to the multiplicity. Which is to say that always becoming is a question of contextualization. It's a question of interaction and of function, not of how something ought to function, like how Freud thinks what desire ought to be or what it really is. They want to insist on the activity of processes as creating the objects that come out of these processes. And then in fact, the relation to the supposed object is precisely that the object is a process, always engaged in a social relation. And this plateau is particularly helpful because Deleuze and Guattari are giving us a very substantive take on what exactly action should look like. We could think of this as to become schizo, so to speak. Not as literally becoming mentally ill, like schizophrenic, but as using schizophrenia as a model for how to reach these limit experiences, so to speak. And Deleuze and Guattari talk about this lady named Franny. I'm not sure who Franny is, but Franny recounts this dream where there's a desert, and in the desert there's crowds of people and crowds of bees and soccer players, and all this stuff is going on. And Franny says, I am on the edge of the crowd at the periphery, but I belong to it. I am attached to it by one of my extremities, a hand or a foot. I know that the periphery is the only place I can be, that I would die if I let myself be drawn into the center of the fray, but just as certainly if I let go of the crowd. This is not an easy position to stay in. It is even very difficult to hold, for these beings are in constant motion, and their movements are unpredictable and follow no rhythm. They swirl, go north, then suddenly east. None of the individuals in the crowd remains in the same place in relation to the others. So I too am in perpetual motion. All this demands a high level of tension, but it gives me a feeling of violent, almost vertiginous happiness. A very good schizo dream. To be fully a part of the crowd and at the same time completely outside it, removed from it, to be on the edge, to take a walk like Virginia Woolf. Never again will I say, I am this, I am that. To be in an assemblage, which an assemblage is essentially a social entity, is necessarily to tend away from the center and to tend away from centralization. Because one of the problems that they see, and we can really see this as, I spoke last time of the rhizome, and the rhizome has all these shoots and nodules, and it's essentially a multiplicitous, non-hierarchical form. But if we zoom in on the rhizome, there is always going to be points which start to converge and start to create these rings of filiation. They start to conglomerate around single points. Now, this can be the possibility for a line of flight. This motion that is created, I mean, if we think about this as in a location on the body without organs, on the rhizome, let's say it's taking place right here, and it creates this kind of vortex, so to speak, where there's all these flows that are crossing each other at different points, but in this one particular spot, they're crossing each other such that a singularity starts to form. A partial object starts to form, and this partial object grows and forms a territory. So around this partial object, this thing that is just allowed to spring up, suddenly around it, it becomes more than a partial object. It becomes a despotic object. It becomes the despotic signifier, as I talked about in some of my Anti-Oedipus lectures. We could think of this as any number of things. This could be a state formation. This could be an opium poppy. This could be a person, or most importantly, it could be Oedipus. And these partial objects spring up as just possibilities on the rhizome. They're things that things happen to conglomerate towards, and it works. And an important part of Deleuze and Guattari's schizoanalysis is they do not reject Oedipus as a possibility. They simply reject it as a despotic signifier, which is to say, as the only possibility. They reject the proliferation of this despotic signifier infinitely. Because what Freud does is, instead of saying, okay, this is part of a rhizome, and because of that, there is some, there's some flow happening through here, and it gets pulled in and changed. Let's say we've got a flow here, and it gets pulled in, and look at that. It creates a line of flight. It takes this flow, which is related to other flows, and by the relation to an intensive unity, it allows a line of flight to come out. So even within a state formation, the opium trade, the Oedipus complex, there are always these contra-state lines, contra-Oedipus lines, contra-opium trade, whatever it may be, which spring up. So these aren't necessarily bad things, so long as we use them as a springboard, so long as we take what is available, the objects that come about, because in a sense, every object that is allowed to appear on the rhizome will do this to varying extents. It will start to create a territory. And like the opium poppy, around it will start to become social, like trading relations, first off, and then these trading relations create geographic and political tensions over who is going to own opium, and then whole trading cartels get created, and before you know it, some simple object has this whole territory that it has created. And out of this, it creates the potential for despotism. Just like we saw with the opium trade and with like the Dutch East India Company, I think it was pretty involved in the opium trade. Even Teddy Roosevelt was he was an opium dealer before he was president. This creates the possibility for disenfranchisement of certain groups, creates really the possibility and the impetus for colonialism. And Deleuze and Guattari think that capital is one of these singularities, one of these despotic unities that will form. And what's important to do is they say, look, capitalism has some potential because it is going to constantly cross these boundaries. Think of when at one time we thought that the earth was overpopulated because we weren't going to have the food to care for people. But of course, at this, it stirred a line of flight that created all sorts of creation, such that we found new ways to cultivate food, and then we weren't in danger of overpopulation. Now we're starting to get closer to that danger of overpopulation too. And the important part about capitalism is it's essentially schizophrenic in a sense, insofar as it crosses these boundaries and is constantly going to make new connections to try to surpass its limitations. But it does this to be despotic, to be all-encompassing, instead of the schizophrenic takes advantage of things like capital or the state or Oedipus and uses them as springboards. And this is what they mean by being on the edge of the crowd, being at the periphery. And this doesn't mean one is separate from the crowd. This line of flight is irreconcilably tied to this singularity insofar as it's a vector, right? It depends upon its relation to something else, which defines it as a multiplicity on the rhizome and on the full body without organs behind this. So the important guide for action is that becoming is the only substance we have. And even then, becoming is not a substance. Deleuze and Guattari don't like the idea of substances. They like to think of pure, multiplicitous becoming and changing and interaction, such that everything is contingent upon everything else. And constantly, within any of these, maybe you're caught in something like this. Maybe this is capitalism or a family relation or something like this. Instead of tending towards the center, you want to try to operate on the outside. And not only do you want to operate on the outside going like this and orbiting around the center. This is kind of a solar system model of being, perhaps, which, even though it's on the outside, it's revolutionary. It's really not revolutionary because it's complicit with the force that really is dragging it inward, in a sense, right? This motion is contained by its relation to the center. Instead, we want to tend outwards. And this is what Deleuze and Guattari mean when they're talking about perpendicular action. Instead of just continuing on this tangential path relative to the center, instead of going like that, we want to go like that. We want to create a perpendicular path that shoots off like the shoot of a rhizome and allows for the tendency to alter this field by this force. And you're not getting outside of the rhizome or this unity or the crowd structure, but you are altering this crowd structure via this force of the line of flight. Because in the sense, the line of flight can be both within this structure and as one approaches the structure and chooses how to ricochet off of it. In terms of identification, we want to learn to have an eye for the assemblage instead of having an eye for despotic structures and unities. They say Freud tried to approach crowd phenomena from the point of view of the unconscious, but he did not see clearly. He did not see that the unconscious itself was fundamentally a crowd. He was myopic and hard of hearing. He mistook crowds for a single person. Schizos, on the other hand, have sharp eyes and ears. They don't mistake the buzz and shove of the crowd for daddy's voice. When we look at ontology like this, it is completely absurd to reduce it to anything. Because to reduce the rhizome to daddy's voice, to the Oedipus complex, to castration, is really to transform this into this. It's essentially to look past what reality is and say, no, let's insist on Oedipus, which strictly speaking is just not true. It's just insisting that ontology is otherwise than it actually is. It's insisting that multiplicity is not what's real. What's real is the unconscious, which is structured just how I like it. But no, ontology doesn't respect us like that. It passes and creates filiative boundaries and territories and lines of flight. In terms of the body without organs, and this is why I said in the last lecture that I think reading Anti-Oedipus is good before you read 1,000 Plateaus, but we can get a good sense of what they mean by the body without organs. They say a body without organs is not an empty body stripped of organs, but a body upon which that which serves as organs, wolves, wolf eyes, wolf jaws, is distributed according to crowd phenomena, in Brownian motion, in the form of molecular multiplicities. The desert is populous. Thus, the body without organs is opposed less to organs as such than to the organization of the organs, insofar as it composes an organism. The body without organs is not a dead body, but a living body,
all the more alive and teeming once it has blown apart the organism and its organization. Lice hopping on the beach, skin colonies. The full body without organs is a body populated by multiplicities. The problem of the unconscious has most certainly nothing to do with generation, but rather peopling, population. It is an affair of worldwide population on the full body of the earth, not organic familial generation. The body without organs is particularly difficult to talk about. We can basically think of this as a structuring field. This is the field in which the rhizome operates. And basically, it's a three-dimensional structure. I gotta remember how this works. You've got your x-plane, your y-plane, and your z-plane going out this way. And we can see this is protruding out this way. And within this, we have a rhizome making all these affiliative connections, tubers, and whatever it may be. And the body without organs is basically this space of articulation. And Deleuze and Guattari are going to say later that the body without organs is basically a zero state. It is not necessarily productive. It is simply that upon which lines are instantiated. And the body without organs is going to resist organization in the sense of organization, to be made organ. It's going to resist this tendency for organs to develop insofar as the body without organs is going to operate rhizomatically, because it is related to the rhizome. This body without organs, this is the problem with drawing it. I really can't draw it. It's more of a conceptual structure. But it is an empty field which has no identity in and of itself. It is not this separate, strictly unitary, infinite coordinate plane in 3 dimensions. No, the dimensions of the body without organs is the dimensions of the rhizomes. It is not reducible to the rhizome, but the way it functions is derived from and irreconcilably connected to the rhizome. And as such, the body without organs is a living organism, insofar as it is an organism of multiplicities. It is not a stagnant organism, but just like any organism, it is only insofar as it is a multiplicitous, rhizomatic process structure, so to speak. And therefore, the body without organs is defined by a living presence, life as becoming and changing. And thus, the body without organs is not going to tend towards any one thing that stands outside of the body without organs. It's not going to create organic familial generation. It's just going to be multiplicitous. And in this sense, you could probably talk about the body without organs pretty similar to how you could just talk about the rhizome in general. They say, people say, after all, schizophrenics have a mother and a father, don't they? Sorry, no, none as such. They only have a desert with tribes inhabiting it, a full body clinging with multiplicities. Which is to say, when we get out of this idea of the subject, and we look at the schizophrenic insofar as he constantly schizzes, his subjectivity is really just this non-hierarchical becoming. There is no mommy and daddy with a capital M and a capital D. There are just multiplicities of interactions creating an assemblage. Now, in terms of talking about these multiplicities, it may sound like they're just creating a new form of substance. But in fact, they want to continue to say that all that is related to an assemblage and to a territory such that that thing is defined by the thresholds or the limits of the territory. And when talking about these multiplicities, they say that they are rhizomatic. And they say that one of these essential characteristics, which is just principle one of the rhizome, each element ceaselessly varies and alters its distance in relation to the others. There's this commutability of parts of the rhizome, that it's structured by being schizo, by jumping and moving points and skipping like a CD, like I've said before. And they say these variable distances are not extensive qualities divisible by each other. Rather, each is indivisible, or relatively indivisible. In other words, they are not divisible below or above a certain threshold. They cannot increase or diminish without their elements changing in nature. Which is to say, like we had before with this is kind of an arborescent structure insofar as it has this unity towards which it tends. And even though it has levels, ultimately, everything is being defined in relation to a significatory unity. When we're talking about partial objects, we're necessarily talking about a territory that they are involved in. If we are talking about books, this book exists in a territory. It exists in relation to the camera and in relation to my body and the airflows and the air pressure in the room. All this is irrevocably connected to what it is to be this thing. This is the critically social part of Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy. And because of this, the objects that come to find themselves located within this sort of singularity are defined by certain thresholds, certain things which they can do according to this unity. We can think of this unity as Oedipus, for example, and therefore all these partial objects have their being insofar as they are related to Oedipus. This is despotic signification right here, because in order to talk about these, we necessarily have to presuppose Oedipus in order to say anything definite about them at all. And as such, these partial objects have a very limited amount of things that they can really do, right? Because we're talking about what do we really desire. So everything that they actually do here can be a number of things. It will pass the boundaries of what Oedipus says it will be able to do. It will do things that are contra Oedipus. But this stuff that is contra Oedipus will just get lopped off like Freud does. Because there's this wide range of possible actions, only some of which are accountable as Oedipus and by Oedipus, there are possible lines of flight by realizing that partial objects and the intensities that create them have a threshold which is defined by that thing around which they rotate. And because of that, there is a very definite, in a sense, line of flight that comes about. Even if they're difficult to find, there must be lines of flight within every structure that comes about, because there are necessarily going to be things that will not be accountable or reducible to the structure. There can't be. And this is probably one of the weirdest things about Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy, is their shift away from substance towards intensity. They say, the metric principle of these multiplicities is not to be found in a homogeneous milieu, but resides elsewhere, in forces at work within them, in physical phenomena inhabiting them, precisely in the libido, which constitutes them from within, and in constituting them necessarily divides into distinct qualitative and variable flows. These flows essentially have a crowd or social nature. And this is an important thing that they'll say a little bit later, is that instead of trying to reduce things to the one, like Freud does, to that signifier which stands atop Oedipus, castration, whatever it may be, they say what should have been done is the opposite. All of this should be understood in intensity. The wolf is the pack, in other words, the multiplicity instantaneously apprehended as such, insofar as it approaches or moves away from zero, each distance being non-decomposable. Zero is the body without organs of the wolfman. If the unconscious knows nothing of negation, it is because there is nothing negative in the unconscious, only indefinite moves toward and away from zero, which does not at all express lack, but rather the positivity of the full body as support and prop. The wolves designate an intensity, a band of intensity, a threshold of intensity on the wolfman's body without organs. So everything that is an intensity. It's a libidinal flow. Flows is one of their most important topics, and we can take this from Heraclitus for sure, talking about rivers flowing and whatnot. But because of the fact that everything is an intensity, everything is therefore productive, insofar as any intensity here there is no lack here. There is only process, function, relation. All of these are productive insofar as the relation of any one point on the rhizome to the next necessarily incurs the fact that each point is productive of the other and constitutes the other. And because of this, there's nothing negative here. There is only positive processes occurring. And thus Deleuze and Guattari completely forget about the idea of lack. Instead, they say everything that is, because it results from intensive differences, intensities in this assemblage, it therefore is a positive encounter. And an encounter is an important part of their philosophy, because instead of focusing on identity, on what something is, they want to talk about encounters. How do things function? How do things relate? How do things interact? How do things create multiplicities and schizzes and lines of flight? We can see what they mean by the encounter when they say the wolf as the instantaneous apprehension of a multiplicity in a given region is not a representative, a substitute, but an I feel. I feel myself becoming the wolf, one wolf among others, on the edge of the pack. Becoming wolf, becoming animal, one of their more important topics, means simply being a multiplicity among multiplicity, a bear among bears, as the saint says in the prologue to the Thus Spoke Zarathustra. That instead of being representative of some higher order or some pre-conscious order which structures the unconscious, instead there is merely the I feel, the I interact, I produce, I encounter flows in my becoming. They say lines of flight or of deterritorialization, becoming wolf, becoming inhuman, deterritorialized intensities. That is what multiplicity is. To become wolf or to become whole is to deterritorialize oneself following distinct but entangled lines. A whole is no more negative than a wolf. Castration, lack, substitution, a tale told by an overconscious idiot who has no understanding of multiplicities as formations of the unconscious. A wolf is a whole. They are both particles of the unconscious, nothing but particles, productions of particles, particulate paths, as elements of molecular multiplicities. It is not even sufficient to say that intense and moving particles pass through holes. A hole is just as much a particle as what passes through it. And a sick roast to Freud, but the important thing here is that they reject this idea of a whole as a negativity that is. They think that which is must necessarily come out of a productive process and itself be a productive process of becoming. So it does not make sense to even talk about lack or negativity in Deleuze and Guattari's ontology. I mean, where are you going to find negativity? For them, these spaces in between the rhizome, even this is part of the rhizome insofar as it represents an open probability space. I mean, if you think about, for example, a wave after the point of articulation is going to emanate outward, and it's going to do so forever, but decreasing in intensity, such that at the limits, it's going to decrease as the limit approaches infinity, or it's going to approach zero as the limit approaches infinity. Which is to say that essentially there is no empty space. There is only productive space filled with this kind of Brownian motion of possibilities of flows. And therefore, to think of something as a multiplicity is to think of it as a deterritorialized intensity. To get things down to this structure and away from this despotic structure. To look at what is, not as a substance, but as an interactive process. And this is the very substance, if we can even say that. Maybe it would even be better to say process of schizoanalysis. This is going to go on to structure their talking about things like the war machine and kind of like anthropological concepts. But they distinguish between the crowd and the pack. For them, a crowd is despotic. And in comparison, the pack is a multiplicity. And not multiplicity as dots, as a constellation. No, this is a big misstep in Deleuzean ontology because it presumes definite points and substances. Instead, the multiplicity is rhizomatic, right? It's all these different intensities and lines of flight and whatever it may be. These structures are actually quite related. They're able to spring out of each other, like we've kind of talked about before, how there's going to tend to be partial objects that come about from the rhizome in which structure other flows, but which also can be resisted as the limit experience. And also within this, there's rhizomatic potential because partial objects will not be able to be fully accounted for by the singularity itself. But the pack here is essentially defined as the skits, or the skits flow. It takes new lines of flight and even territory for the pack, for the nomad, is used as a line of flight, as something which one uses as a temporary springboard. Whereas the crowd is probably just more hierarchical. It's unitary in a sense, because when we have this despotic signifier like this, everything gets reduced to the one. And they say the pack, even on its own turf, is constituted by a line of flight or of deterritorialization that is a component part of it, and to which it accredits a high positive value. Whereas masses only integrate these lines in order to segment them, obstruct them, ascribe them a negative sign. On both of these structures, there are lines of flight. which are going to come out, and this is the possibility of nearness. And this is our creative schizoanalytic process, is to follow these lines of flight, not to escape the rhizome, but to transform the rhizome on the full body without organs, in a sense to become a body without organs, as one of their later plateaus is called. If we compare the way lines of flight are treated, here's kind of some nodules, some partial objects. In the crowd, it is, because really, this is the difference between capitalism and schizophrenia. And I know this is a bit of an elusive concept. When you pick up the book, you're like, sometimes it sounds like they're valorizing capitalism. And it's like, okay, well, what is the difference between capitalism and schizophrenia? Capitalism, too, tends to deterritorialize and defilialize. Well, really, capitalism is essentially focused on integration. It expands its territory, and this bubble of what capital can control is going to expand and deterritorialize. So it is going to use these lines of flight, but only in order to integrate everything into a larger and larger structural unity. So in a sense, the territory is always going to be capital, and deterritorialization, thus, is negative in a sense. It is entertained only in order to be effaced. And this is the same thing Hegel does with difference. He says, oh, we need pure becoming, but then he says, no, pure becoming is ultimately reduced to the one. The one here is capital, is hierarchy, is territory. Whereas the schiz is defined by its lines of flight. It does not have a ring-like structure centered around a despotic signifier. It has a schizophrenic structure, which is to say that the structure itself is the process by which it is defined. So for Deleuze and Guattari, ontology, and specifically creative processes, are defined by action and process, and thus not by integration into a model, but by the cessation of the model and the dissolution of the model in favor of the process as such. They quote Elias Canetti. I'm not exactly sure where they're from, so I'm not going to put any pronunciation on it. But Canetti says, in the changing constellation of the pack, in its dances and expeditions, he will again and again find himself at its edge. He may be in the center, and then immediately afterwards at the edge again, at the edge, and then back in the center. When the pack forms a ring around the fire, each man will have neighbors to the right and left, but no one behind him. His back is naked and exposed to the wilderness. The pack here has the potential to become re-territorialized, to start to be structured around the fire, and thus process turns into a hierarchical process. Amalgamation turns into despotic amalgamation. And thus, the pack always has the tendency to become the crowd, because, right, the crowd is defined as circulating around certain things. A crowd is structured around a school fight, or a state institution, or the new iPhone, or whatever it may be. Whereas the pack is essentially schizophrenic. But as we can see in the quote, when the wolves enter around this center, their backs are open. And their backs being open is precisely the line of flight. Because when the wolves go around the fire, well, they're creating this, this sense of security and unity and totalization. Everything is warm and lit up, but their backs are cold and exposed. And that's the sort of thing that Deleuze and Guattari want to do. They want to find what are the things that can't be accounted for by the narrative of the totality, and how can we use that to break out of totalizing narratives? A very postmodern position indeed. And this actually has a lot to do with how Deleuze and Guattari differ from Gilles Baudrillard. For Baudrillard, he thinks that ultimately we've reached a point of no return where this is our totalizing narrative, is capital, is really the death drive and things like this, and that we can't get to this schiz flow anymore, or this rhizomatic process, because the territory has been cemented so much so that everything can be completely accounted for by the territory. Deleuze and Guattari think that is impossible. That's the only kind of thing, like was said in the last lecture, that it's really something that can just be done out of ignorance almost. That really, this is something that can only occur, like they say, a language is never enclosed upon itself except as a function of impotence. Which is to say, no structure is ever completely closed unless we just throw our hands in the air. And really that's what Baudrillard does, is he just throws his hands in the air and he says, okay, we can't solve this. Deleuze and Guattari say, no, because really this is just a cementing of the subject position. Now, Baudrillard does try to get outside the subject, and I think that's where he starts to do something productive in the schizophrenic sense. Something genuinely productive that takes advantage of these possibilities that are latent in the assemblage. Deleuze and Guattari say there are only multiplicities of multiplicities forming a single assemblage, operating in the same assemblage. Packs in masses and masses in packs. Trees have rhizome lines and the rhizome points of arborescence. How could mad particles be produced with anything but a gigantic cyclotron? How could lines of deterritorialization be assignable outside of circuits of territoriality? Where else but in wide expanses and in major upheavals in those expanses could a tiny rivulet of new intensity suddenly start to flow? So ultimately, everything is one big assemblage, one big social process related to everything else through multiplicities. And through this, really it's kind of the fight that Hegel talked about in the master-slave dialectic. But it's not so much about recognition, so much it is just a fight of pure intensities and an explosion of pure intensities. And I think this is why Deleuze and Guattari's work is so exciting. But they say, how could lines of deterritorialization be assignable outside of circuits of territoriality? Which is to say, we need this circuit of territory in order to figure out where the lines of flight actually are. So we're basing our action off a rhizomatic structure, but oftentimes it is easiest to find these lines of flight within a territorial structure. And that deterritorialization, of course, necessitates the predicate of a territory to be deterritorialized. And thus, these processes are actually quite connected. The pack of wolves can become the crowd hierarchicalized around the fire. And like they said, the tree has rhizomes, and the rhizome can create an arborescent structure. There's always this back and forth that has to be straddled. And they already said earlier, this is a difficult position to be in, and it's not a stable position. And that's the definition, is it's not stability and presentness. It's becoming and not yetness. Never yetness, really. Now, because they're focused on process, this necessarily means that they reject the idea of isolated subjecthood. They want to entertain the dissolution of the subject in favor of an assemblage, which is necessarily a society-wide, a purely social process of crossing boundaries of territory. They say there are no individual statements, only statement-producing machinic assemblages. We say that the assemblage is fundamentally libidinal and unconscious. It is the unconscious in person. And this is their focus on the unconscious as a machine. They talk about desiring machines a lot in Anti-Oedipus.
machine assemblages is a big part of Anti-Oedipus as a whole. And the point is that machines are productive. Even when machines break down and they skits and they start and stop, this is a productive thing. Because even when they're not producing what they're supposed to, they're engaged in a process of not producing. They're essentially productive insofar as it is something new and unique and in relation to an assemblage. They say we can no longer even speak of distinct machines, only of types of interpenetrating multiplicities that at any given moment form a single machinic assemblage, the faceless figure of the libido. Each of us is caught up in an assemblage of this kind, and we reproduce its statements when we think we are speaking in our own name. Or rather, we speak in our own name when we produce its statement. And what bizarre statements they are. Truly the talk of lunatics. And of course, they think we should be talking like lunatics. Which is to say, we have the name, the real name. And this is what psychoanalysis says that dreams are oriented towards. We want to get to what we really desire. Talk with our real voice, not how we're being made to speak. This is kind of the whole, it's kind of like being woke in the classic sense of being awakened to that which is being imposed upon one. But Deleuze and Guattari think this is not done by trying to get to some name which is always ahead of one, which is never actually what's being acted out. Rather, they want to say the dream is the name. The dream is not indicative of some name that is always outstripped from us, but rather, this is the voice with which we speak. We speak in the voice of process. This is why they say that we no longer speak in distinct machines. Rather than speaking in something distinct, we speak in something that is schizophrenic. Think about dreams. Dreams are not hierarchical. You're in school naked, then suddenly you're in a meeting, then suddenly you're eating lunch, then you fall off a cliff. It constantly is engaging in skits flows. So the dream can actually be something quite productive because it's not bound by our conscious needs to fall in line with an order, but rather it is merely an unconscious process of desire. It allows these desires to coalesce with one another and create this assemblage which is called the subject in conscious life. But in fact, it's not a subject at all. It's an assemblage that necessarily connects with the anus and the mother and the father and the state apparatus and all this other stuff. It necessarily crosses these boundaries which are presupposed for someone like Freud or Lacan. Like I talked about before with the Oedipal singularity, partial objects will necessarily come up which will be referred to Oedipus. And some of them will act Oedipally. They will genuinely act as a consequence of the mother and father. When you act in life, some things may in fact be the result of the mother and father. Maybe this is a result of a good memory, maybe something traumatic, maybe a divorce or something like that. Of course, some things are related to the parents as that structuring thing which defines that anxiety, but not everything. So within this Oedipal framework, there are necessarily things that are not reducible to the parent. And this is what Deleuze and Guattari want to insist on. That the wolfman is engaged in becoming wolf. He's engaged in his own productive process. There is this dream, and it could mean so many things, but Freud just drops the ball because he insists, as
the Oedipal apparatus as what Deleuze and Guattari call the immobile motor that must be found everywhere. They say, and a counter-Oedipal apparatus, incest with the sister, schizo-incest, or love with people of inferior situation, and anality, homosexuality, all that Freud sees only as Oedipal substitutes, regressions, and derivatives. Which is to say, when we think Oedipally, some forms of action are derivative. You know, they're not the true action. They're not what you really want. And Freud will say that. He's like, no, this dream is not what you really want. What you really want is to take the place of your father, and you wanted to be the one fucking your mom, not your dad. And this haunts you because the father is always something ahead of you that you can never really become. No. In fact, we have all the reasons to believe that this dream could be so much more. Freud has to do so much gymnastics to reduce the Wolfman to the castration complex and the Oedipus complex. Instead, Freud does this all the time. And he even says this sometime where he talks about that the Wolfman's dream is completely still. And he's like, you might be asking, how does this present content relate to a latent content, the interaction with the parents having sex, which is so active? There's all this movement and it's violent. And Freud's like, well, this is what happens sometimes in dream interpretation. Something presents itself as its opposite so that it is not, so that it doesn't hit you with all the force, because if it did, you wouldn't be able to handle it. So your brain protects you from some of these things. And thus, the dream content sometimes means exactly the opposite of what it actually does. Deleuze and Guattari are like, come on, man. You're taking a completely static dream and making it represent something which is violent and really the exact opposite of what is being had in the dream. And maybe it is the case that some things are represented through dreams as the exact opposite of what someone wants. But there's no systematic way to figure this out. And Deleuze and Guattari say, this completely avoids the point that what we want is the dream. The dream is an emanation of what we want, not hiding what we want, but showing what we want through a process. How could it appear if it wasn't something we wanted? And Freud says, well, oh, you see, the fact that it appeared as such shows precisely that you want what it covers up. But this presumes that it's covering up something in the first place. It presumes the signifier of ahead of time, such that the dream covers something up and, oh, that's exactly what you want, so that Dr. Freud isn't right. It's like, yeah, what if we do want you to be wrong? What if we want Dr. Freud to be wrong? And what if he is wrong? That's what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to say. Now, Deleuze and Guattari are not too favorable to names. They think that the name is an attempt. Just like Baudrillard talks about the body as something that was created to localize guilt and create this idea of a subject that could be ruled over, Deleuze and Guattari think that the proper name covers up all the becomings, which this proper name really is. They say the Wolfman, a true proper name, an intimate first name linked to the becomings, infinitives, and intensities of a multiplied and depersonalized individual. Which is to say that individuals are not individuals. They are depersonalized intensities on the body without organs. And then they give us just the most amazing rebuttal and just the most savage philosophical moment I've ever read. They say, what does psychoanalysis know about multiplication? The desert hour when the dromedary becomes 1,000 dromedaries snickering in the sky. The evening hour when 1,000 holes appear on the surface of the earth. Castration, castration, cries the psychoanalytic scarecrow, who never saw more than a hole, a father or a dog where wolves are, a domesticated individual where there are wild multiplicities. We are not just criticizing psychoanalysis for having selected Oedipal statements exclusively, for such statements are to a certain extent part of a machinic assemblage, for which they could serve as correctional indexes, as in a calculation of errors. We are criticizing psychoanalysis for having used Oedipal enunciation to make patients believe they would produce individual, personal statements and would finally speak in their own name. The trap was set from the start. Never will the wolfman speak. Talk as he must about wolves, howl as he might like a wolf. Freud does not even listen. He glances at his dog and answers, "It's daddy." For as long as that lasts, Freud calls it neurosis. When it cracks, it's psychosis. This is to say they're not rejecting Oedipus as a possibility, like we talked about before, but instead they're considering Oedipus as something that need not totalize, because it's so obvious that we cannot reduce everything to Oedipus, that Oedipus is something imposed from the start. But instead, Freud just refuses to listen and closes his ears. I mean, it's as if he doesn't even need his patients in the first place. And instead, he just needs you here for the information so that he may get on his high horse and say, "Oh no, it's just daddy." It's like, are you even analyzing anymore? It sounds like all the work that's being done is not figuring out what you really desire, but figuring out how what you just said links up to something I've decided that you desire. The Wolfman will receive the psychoanalytic Medal of Honor for his services, rendered to the cause, and even disabled veterans' benefits. He could have spoken in his own name only if the machinic assemblage that was produced particular statements in him had been brought to light. But there's no question of that in psychoanalysis. At the very moment the subject is persuaded that he or she will be uttering the most individual of statements, he or she is deprived of all basis of enunciation. Which is to say, when you engage in the psychoanalytic process as the analysand, and you're being analyzed, you're almost paying someone else to speak for you. You're given this Medal of Honor, and it's like, oh, you and Freud together figured this out. But no, Freud told you what to do, really. Freud told you what you wanted and made you believe that this is what you really wanted, instead of actually analyzing the dream. Not in the light of some despotic signifier, but instead looking at the content and seeing, how is this something I desire? Let's look at the relations I'm involved in and figure this thing out, and cross these boundaries and see how this process will bring out desire. Silence people, prevent them from speaking, and above all, when they do speak, pretend they haven't said a thing. The famous psychoanalytic neutrality. The wolfman keeps howling, 6 wolves, 7 wolves. Freud says, how's that? Goats, you say? How interesting. Take away the goats and all you have left is a wolf. So it's your father. That is why the wolfman feels so fatigued. He's left lying there with all his wolves in his throat, all these little holes on his nose, and all those libidinal values on his body without organs. The war will come. The wolves will become Bolsheviks, and the wolfman will remain suffocated by all he had to say. All we will be told is that he became well-behaved, polite, and resigned again, honest and scrupulous. In short, cured. He gets back by pointing out that psychoanalysis lacks a truly zoological vision. Nothing can be more valuable for a young person than the love of nature and a comprehension of the natural sciences, in particular zoology. And this is the important part that I think we can take exactly what they're saying about Freud to things much further, which is that signification, like Oedipus or like the phallus, is used for the purposes of pacification, of making one well-behaved, polite, doing exactly what Oedipus wants you to. In this sense, we can see Deleuze and Guattari are inspiring a rather radical sense of politics, of going against the grain, of avant-garde in its very essence. And they're so sad, in a sense, that the patient is completely ignored. that everything that one had to say, one says to Freud, he shoves it back in your throat using Oedipus as the plug to make sure you never really get to use your voice. You get to use your actual voice, which Freud decided for you. And in this sense, we can see that all that Freud and Lacan are doing are really their desires to impose structures in order upon something that, as Deleuze and Guattari said, has long lost that structure. It is to insist on the reproduction of Oedipus, when clearly there are processes that have gone far beyond Oedipus, but which Freud would like to reduce, really so that he can become your father, so that he's your daddy that's telling you exactly what you should do. I hope this has been interesting, giving you some food for thought. Check out my other lectures on Deleuze and Guattari, on Anti-Oedipus, on Thousand Plateaus, and I'll see you in another lecture.